So let's start right now, and thank you very much, first of all, for joining you first to our panelists, and I'll go more in details on this, but also to the attendance. I know people are trickling down, in the next few minutes and entering this webinar. We're in August, so we're all to some extent coming back, or for some that are very lucky. I know one of the panelists especially is leaving on vacation tomorrow. So that's a moment that I know that a lot of people will be on vacation and might actually watch also the recorded version of this webinar. So I mean, we will be able to share it afterwards. But I wanted to thank you therefore to join by our series of webinar on ESG best practices in extractive and energy sector. We did cover, as some of you know, a series of elements on community consent, on induced communities, on local content, on social performance. And this is a little bit more the second panel that we would want to develop on local content, following the one with the IFC, Total Energies was there, Sheila Kama, others. We're building on issues of best practice in local content. And we wanted to address here the specific case of Mozambique, Uganda, and Tanzania, a very interesting region. And I know Yanick, who's here, will actually expand on this as a first speaker. But first, I wanted maybe to introduce our different panelists. I mentioned, first we joined by Patricia Graham. So Patricia is unfortunately very early retired, because you should have been staying much longer, and it's good that you're actually joining us right now on this webinar. Patricia is a lawyer by background. She obviously worked 30 years in the large oil and gas industry. But what's interesting with Patricia is the background. So I'm kind of adding some personal stuff, because we've been talking a lot, the background of both governmental affairs, but also understanding of sustainability. And I know that you've been spending the last few months specifically on a series of training on sustainability, on human rights with the UN system and others. So there's a very interesting view on seeing how the SDGs and transition in the energy world can be seen through the oil and gas company vision. We also have to continue on our lovely guest, Taciana. We have Taciana is also someone that has this joint expertise from lawyer background with TPLA, but also you actually created, you're president of Mozambique Women of Energy. So this understanding of seeing also social performance and gender issues that can be benefiting from the trickling down in investment, both in oil and gas, but also in renewable and mining. So we maybe might be able to bridge into this in terms of some of the mining folks that are joining us in this webinar. And then for the gentleman side, we also have both Thomas and Yanick. So Yanick, I've known Yanick for quite some time. Yanick is actually in Maputo, and so one of the person that I listen very often when I try to get a better sense of current news in Maputo. Is a graduate in business management from the US, and actually works as managing director of Inova D'or for the last 7 years, working especially in the mining and the energy sector, looking at juridic aspects, but also the political approach, the aspects of potential economic development, and we've been discussing for quite some time with Yanick, not always with a suit, and very formally in a webinar, but much more in lovely restaurants in Maputo and different places of Mozambique. So I'm very happy that you with us, Yanick. And finally, Thomas. So we have the two French guys, Thomas and myself. Obviously, hopefully the least arrogant of our kind, or at least not having the cliche. We actually good guys if you actually dig a little deeper. But the idea here of trying to get also the perspective from Total, a good friend of mine, and especially a very strong expert. It's not from different projects in Mozambique. I was just mentioning your experience in the oil gas sector, and now also obviously looking at the vision of developing local content strategies and policies in Mozambique, but also in other countries. And that's why I was also very interested to have you from your perspective from Uganda and Congo. If I remember well, you had conversation of time that you spent in Congo before, and continue having this regional expertise on the topic at hand. Just wanted to mention a few small details. This is a Chatham House webinar, so we actually have officially a discussion through our NGO with Chatham House. You have this validated as Chatham House webinars. So please don't share this. I know there's one or two journalists that actually signed it, so I want to be very clear. These are content that shouldn't be applied to specific people, and we don't talk on behalf of our organizations. Definitely not our former organization, but we actually want to be able to share best practices and discussing the way that this could be actually trickling down in terms of development. I've been very long in terms of this introduction. I first, if that's okay with you, to turn probably to Yanick to help me set the stage here in terms of the recent developments in the field of energy, but also mining, if you want to brush upon them in Mozambique, which is definitely a country that you know very well, but a little bit also in Uganda and Tanzania, if you can, I can actually develop on this. Yanick, can you maybe help me set the stage here for some of our folks that are maybe not that familiar with the region, the developments? We also have very strong experts on the field, but you will help me do some introductory remarks. Thank you very much, Yanick.
Thank you, Remi. But just before, just in case I missed, did we introduce Taciana?
Yes, I did introduce Taciana very quite briefly, but I'll give some more words. Yes, absolutely. Yes, I did.
Okay, I guess I was the one that missed it. So thank you, and thank you for being here with all these panelists to talk about such an important issue and very relevant to me as a Mozambican and to this region of Southern Africa. When we look at the landscape in Uganda, Mozambique, and Tanzania, we see that the potential has always been there for energy development. In terms of mining, it's historic about the resources that have been supporting each economy. It's known that Tanzania is very much heavily exporting gold. Mozambique recently, in the turn of the decade, was one of the largest ruby deposits discovered. And in terms of energy, we also see that the projects that we speak about today, Tanzania and Mozambique, in terms of gas, are recent, but in terms of other potential developments, there have been other attempts in hydro, in other sectors to try to develop the region, but it's still been very underdeveloped. Mozambique's installed capacity is about 3,000 megawatts. When you look at Uganda, I believe it's about 500, and Tanzania 1,500, which is a far cry from the regional potential that you see, including Mozambique, stated as the largest Southern African potential of about 187 gigawatts from hydro, from gas, from coal, and the like. Today, the most relevant projects we speak here in Mozambique are two sectors, the hydrosphere and as well as LNG. LNG, it's something that since a few years ago, 2015, we had projected that by today we would be exploring, and it's similar in Tanzania, where it was about the same time where the craze and the hype of the discoveries being almost a joint basin. And as well as for Uganda, its oil production, it was already commercial, declared commercial by 2006, but only recently is it really taking the development, is it going into a development stage? So important to note, Tanzania, Mozambique share a border, and so do Uganda and Tanzania. So the collaboration for the region is very important when it comes to developing energy, especially when it comes to export solutions for Ugandan's oil through the Tanzanian ports. And as well as Mozambique has been a regional supplier of energy and pressed to become more so, but because there's a lacking infrastructure internally, it's not able to both meet the demands of its neighbors and the demands within Mozambique. Going specifically to Mozambique, three projects that I would like to discuss that also give us a look as to what is the ultimate goal of the development, and it trickles down to impacting positively the country in terms of development and the communities. And this goes to the responsibility of not just the multinationals that come in, but to government when it comes to local content. If we look at the Caorabassa Dam, which is Mozambique's primary source of energy, it's been very poor in developing industries internally because it cannot even connect the grid from north-south. And today, to address that need, the government is moving forward with the support of the World Bank in updating the grid to connect that to the southern region where there's more industrial demand, and as well expanding the Caorabassa Dam potential downstream with the project Anankua that would almost double its capacity to also service the region. These are projects that have been in talk with South Africa, Zimbabwe, and the like. And going into gas, the LNG, which is mostly focused on faraway markets to make feasible, has also been stated as a benefit to the country due to the windfall from the tax revenue and the potential to increase Mozambican growth that would impact ultimately each community. Cabo Delgado is the region that we are focusing when we talk about development, but Cabo Delgado is also the poorest, one of the poorest provinces in the country. And when you look at the resource wealth, it's a disparity between when resources were started to be explored and what kind of development has occurred in that region. So this touches on the concern of local content of, do these projects with the potential they hold actually develop the communities? Yes. And when not properly, sorry?
No, maybe to build on this, and that's very interesting to you. You actually mentioned the developments, but also now looking at maybe socio-economic issues and level of developments and the gaps, because we're going to try to look at bridging the gaps. I very much appreciate you touching upon this. I just wanted also to mention that I see there was some raised hands from the attendants. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat. But indeed, that's very interesting to brush upon, and if you could actually comment on these potentially gaps that could be bridged by a series of local content policies that would help me transition then afterwards to Patty. Thank you, Yanick.
Okay. So the bridge has always been a government solution. Government has to help the companies that wish to invest know how they can best serve each community. The discussions of local content go mostly towards a discussion of shareholding. And there are three pillars usually when we talk about local content that we focus on. There's your shareholding, there's your management control, and there's your skills transfer. For the level of capacity that we have installed, we are very unable to participate in mega projects in terms of shareholding and equal capital and raising about 51% of the equity. And in terms of management as well, when you consider the expertise of these companies that come from abroad and the kind of credentials that you need to lead such projects, we're building capacity, but not quite. The easiest has been to try to capacitate the local workers. And this has also been the easiest way to build a relationship with communities that see a project encroaching onto their lands and not feel left out or kicked out of any potential growth, is to capacitate the communities to participate. And because there always needs to be a long-term solution for these communities, not just come in, build a pipeline, let's say, and then leave, and the communities no longer have any participation on that. There has to be that look, because the outcome, which is what I was trying to hint at when we see that there's mega projects and there's a region that has not developed and there's sorts of resentment from the local population, is the investment risk when it comes to conflict zones, which is what's occurring in Cabo Delgado.
And when you're looking at building capacity on one level, but also socioeconomic risks that impact the capacity for investors or interest for investors and the role of oil and gas companies, maybe just turning to Patricia, when we discuss from the perspective of oil and gas projects on all those important elements that have to be included in terms of the decision to engage into an investment, to develop a project. You've been looking at this, specifically at how to value this, or specifically at how the importance that it is and the responsibility potentially of companies to engage into this. Can you maybe share some thoughts on this?
I think one of the principal things that we have to look at is what kind of responsibilities will the company have, and what kind of interest do they have in tackling some of the issues that come in. And really, you have to separate between what are government responsibilities, for example, and security and protection of human rights comes to mind. But also you have to balance out what is in the best interest of the company to work and make sure that they can address. From a government perspective also, particularly the countries that we're talking about, but many countries which are, still have a large potential of resource development, you are looking at governments that are perhaps working with the UN or relying on World Bank funding and financing. And of course, that ties into sustainable development goals, and where governments are needing to report to continue to be able to obtain this kind of funding. Who do they need to turn to get that kind of information? And I think that's one area where corporations are going to start to see more of a demand and a need. From a responsibility standpoint as well, of course, you've got all the laws and regulations and the contracting agreements. And a lot of times those will set out some of the main responsibilities. And particularly here, I'm thinking, tying back into local content, but going through the community issues, you are talking about, for example, land usage, resettlement, livelihood restoration. And when we think of local content, we do think of workforce development and supplier capacity development, but really, long-term, you're talking about the communities, because the actual activity of developing exploration it takes a while. But once a project goes forward, the construction time is going to be very limited. It's going to be 4 or 5 years. And after that, any jobs that were created are gone. The longer term for the production phases, which go on for 20 years or more, are going to be significantly reduced. So that leads you to the fact that the investment needs to be for longer term. It needs to be focused on the communities. It needs to be diversified, and all the training and skills development needs to be looked at not exclusively as part of oil and gas, but rather transferable. And I think that is one of the key things. You're probably not going to have time to train an engineer to work on that particular upstream area or on the LNG project itself. But you need to be training these engineers where they can be working on longer term future projects so that they can get some experience. From a community standpoint, I think that it's important to note that for decades, if not centuries, corporations have always been responsible to their investors. They have always had to respond to the investors in terms of how they're spending their money, how the money is being allocated, and that it's not being spent on anything other than what investors expected it to be spent on. What we're seeing now, particularly just a few months ago, is that communities are raising their voices to discuss what their issues are. Where they're not seeing a response, they're turning to other audiences that they may have access to, and they are being encouraged to share their concerns. So we saw not too long ago an investor reaction to where, in just 1 week, you saw a reaction by courts in the Netherlands in terms of communities and human rights and the need to reduce emissions. You saw board changes. You saw shareholder resolution.
Yes, it was quite a week in terms of news, indeed. Yes, it
was the big shakeup, and that was all, by the way, on May 26th. So I think that's a day that will be remembered, hopefully, with a lot of recognition of the need to address what these issues are. I think that really what's critical to this, the fact that this all came around full circle, is that the communities themselves, and there are different communities. Of course, you're talking about the local communities that have been living and working for generations on land that is now being designated as potential future site developments, either to extract or to build the facilities to extract. And what happens to these communities when their entire history and future changes? And you look at restitution, you look at at resettlement, so just moving the community. But of course, you have to think, where are they going to go and what are they going to do? And then you have to look at the livelihood restoration. And I think this is where we come back into the area of local content. Again, not just the workforce, but rather, what can these communities do? And typically, it's not necessarily oil and gas or extractives. Well, some of it is and should be.
Maybe a follow-up question on this, and you actually raised very important issues in terms of thinking long-term and trying to see what's happening after the project. But even during the project, there's the construction phase, then the operation phase. There's very different workflows in terms of numbers of employees or types of contracts. So you made that very good point. I know Thomas is probably going to build on this, on the importance to have economic diversification through investment through the oil and gas sector. But I wanted to get also your perspective, from the kind of socializations of projects and the engagement with communities, maybe early in the cycle. And just before this webinar, we're discussing about experience in Cabo Delgado, experience on the ground. When you look at the timeline of engagement with communities, how do you see the best practices in how to re-engage sometimes after a crisis, or to engage at the beginning of a project?
I think one of the biggest criticisms, I think, of engagement from extractive communities, and I don't know if this applies to the mining world as well, but certainly for larger corporations, is that a lot of decisions are made before the companies actually start engaging with, even with the government, much less with the local communities. And there is a need to a degree to have some decision making, because, you know, if you want to go and tell communities what you're doing, you have to have an idea of what you want to do. But it really, the engagement with the community needs to be significantly earlier, because at the point of exploration, you already have an idea of what you're probably going to develop. It's certainly not refined. You don't even know if you're going to find the sufficient amount of resource to develop, but that discussion needs to be had early on, and it's critical because and how you have that discussion is critical, because there may be a significant gap from the first time you come and talk to the community to when the exploration activities have been conducted and have been you know, and a decision is made to go forward. It's a significant amount of time, and quite frankly, I know that there is a concern on how to balance that, because once a big company shows up, expectations multiply. You know, the community expectations will always be going upward. And unfortunately, the thought process of how much is going to be invested, the trend in the past is being downward, absolutely downward.
I will
and
definitely
that's something that is changing.
I will definitely come back to you in the second round of questions on issues of how to engage with communities and transparency of dialogues and others. I think we talked about, you know, the long-term perspective, the very short-term, you know, how to engage from the get-go. There's obviously the large part, which is, you know, doing a project and how to make sure that we can arrive to those long-term, you know, perspective. And then the local business ecosystem is so important, and trying to, you know, work together with the existing local business ecosystem, or to help develop it. And maybe that's, you know, could be a good transition for you, Thomas, of how to, you know, develop these business ecosystem capacities, maybe through large oil and gas projects towards, you know, those long-term perspective. Can you maybe provide some of your expertise and experience in this?
Yeah, sure. I just want to provide a general feedback before getting into the topic. So when we talk about developing business ecosystem, local content, etc., there's often a lot of expectations coming from the concessionaires, and often this expectation leads to a certain passivity with your speech. And what I'd like to emphasize through answering this question is just highlighting that this ecosystem is made of several stakeholders, and they all have a different but key role into optimizing the global local content performance of the project. So we talk about workforce, we talk about the competitive goods and services that require finance, we talk about capacity building capabilities. So yes, so this is just wanted to share this feedback, but also would like a bit more into depth into the various profile of stakeholders that we find into this ecosystem, and how to best and provide a vision on how to best involve them. So of course, all these players are on the market. They need to be provided with the minimum information. So the first thing to do is to conduct an assessment. What exists in the market? What are the gaps when compared with the project needs? And these information need to be efficiently shared with these stakeholders, so they can respectively address the set of challenges that is part of their core business. So let me just state a few key stakeholders, and I will also detail what can be their main contribution. So of course, the first thing is the local authorities and public institutions. So they will set the regulatory framework. They will also be have quite an importance to promote the use of local goods and services, but also provide incentive for foreign investment. It depends on their vision. But it's important to provide incentive, especially when we want to generate new in-country offering. There is also the public institutions. So when we talk about immigration, customs, it's important that the authority also acknowledge their responsibility, and accordingly set up the respective structure to meet the project needs. When we talk about mega projects, it's thousands of workforce coming out in a very short amount of time. It's hundreds of suppliers that are coming, same thing in a very short amount of time. So we need to be prepared, and we need to be able to efficiently and quickly seize those opportunities. So there is some responsibility from the local authority side. Then after, of course, we got the project and the concessionaire. So typically the project and concessionaire will abide by the regulatory framework, but as Patricia mentioned, there's also quite some responsibility in regards to its shareholding, and local content is taking a bigger part of it. So we mentioned local communities, which are key and critical. There is also a whole set about how to operate effective transfer of technology from the oil and gas, I want to say, main contractor expert to the local market. And so one of the roles of the project, the concessionaire, will be to make sure that the whole supply chain is involved in this process and have the required processes so to operate this transfer of technology, but also make the most use of the actual local capacity, either workforce related or SMEs related. And then we have the local companies and representatives. So I know we tend to take them for account, but for me, it's quite important because often one of the main difficulties we have when we do a mega project and want to enhance the local capacity is actually to know who is on the market and who is potential to comply with one of my needs. So if I mention this, it's because market visibility is very, very important to the whole supply chain. And if we want to make, if any project want to make the most use of it, visible. So local companies, there are business associations that are represented in country, and we can very well imagine that these business associations get organized to provide sufficient information to the new market players. And here I'm particularly talking and aiming the international contractors. They come into the market, they don't know the country as much as these local stakeholders, but they need to identify them. If they are not aware that this company or these services exist, they will not contact. It is normal. So there is some responsibility here in regards to local companies, but I put business association could be another entity. Then I also want to mention we have the financial institution, and in those I will include the banks as well. So these are key to address access to finance topic. I think it's a subject we don't talk of it enough, but it is really critical because it has access to finance actually impact on the commercial competitiveness of local companies offer. Some countries are under very high interest rates. Credit line approval can be very long, and it really makes it difficult for local companies to which we have all the process implemented in the supply chain to promote the use of their services, but to be competitive or to be able to invest sufficiently to increase their capacity, etc. So this is a key topic. We have the banks, but we also...
Maybe to build on this, and I like that you actually mentioned the financial system. Maybe you can brush upon the development financial institution that can actually be part of this. Can you also, I mean, and interesting, you know, having all those actors. I know we also mentioned universities and different training centers. Can you actually brush upon this, and then I'll transition, you know, to Taciana on building some of the content and capacities. That's perfect.
Yes, so after, so the other bank access to finance, and when we talk about capacity building, all those universities, etc., gravitating. So of course, the project and all its supply chain go, yes, naturally to them to try to see what is feasible, to identify the local workforce, etc. But mega project, it's a huge market stimulation, and it's important for me. For me, it's key to acknowledge that in the country, there are already entities, consulting entities, training entities, either public or private, that have already this knowledge and that can be reached out to for different reasons. The first one is they know the final trainees better than the international players, but international players will also need to implement those capacity building plans. So they are the best placed person to quickly and efficiently implement training, a first set of training, and communicate on what are their needs, what are the needs of the industry, what are their expectations, so they can revamp facility, update the equipment, update the curriculum, train curriculum as required, and not just support the current project workforce requirement, because the project is only for a set amount of years. So you're not being able to train an engineer from scratch. If you start at the beginning of project construction, however, there will be opportunities for the operation, but it's going to be much less workforce. So, so it's this momentum, and mega project overall should be seen by the ecosystem as a leverage to develop its capacity, not just focusing on projecting, but the overall needs in the country. So multiple projects, using it as a leverage to further invest and and make sure we increase capacity and quality.
I'll come back on the second round on some of the points that I know we wanted to mention on this, but maybe just building on this for Taciana, we centralized a little more on oil and gas at the beginning of this webinar. I know you worked in that sector, but also in the sector of renewable energies, in the mining sectors, as we did. In terms of looking at how to trickle, inclusive development through those projects, can you maybe give us to continue this, presentation of the different actors and the different projects that there is? Give us your perspective on the view on how to create that development through energy investments.
Thank you, Remi, and thank you all for the other panelists for the interesting inputs. Yesterday we had a brief discussion about this, but actually energy, and inclusion, it's a good point where local content and corporate social responsibility should merge. It should be a merge. And why? Because energy, as we treat it now, is a component, an essential component of our lives, but it's the heart of sustainable development because it affects all our life: health, education, security, environment, land use, resettlement, and also other sectors, and the inequalities between citizens that have some disabilities, or between women and men. So I would take a step back probably in our conversation and try to set the scene in respect to this sustainability issue, that we should start by recognizing that we have universal access to energy to all as a fundamental right and as a realization of an ideal of justice. And then we can build on this, because if all of us, and we are talking about communities, we are talking about companies, corporations, governments, we all have our interests. So the governments have the interest to reduce the levels of poverty, to foster investments in the country, to provide employment. The companies also, as Patty mentioned, and also Thomas, they have also their interests. They want their revenues, but they are also concerned in implementing their projects in the right way to provide skills and to have qualified workers, but they also want a social license to operate. Maybe
to include an element, I mean, all those large projects, for example, oil and gas, also very much contribute to the access to energy to a large size of the population, both in Mozambique and others, where people tend to forget that more than half the population doesn't have access to electricity. And yes, that's also positive. So I kind of followed on the steps and tried to bridge from the different views here. Sorry, please continue.
Exactly. No. And if we start from that, and that's where I think all the discussion around energy for all, sustainable development goals, this one, number 7, and energy transition falls, right? Sustainability as a whole. And just to give an example about, for example, the renewable sector, in terms of an indicator of job creation, very interesting, the last job census from Power for All to 2019, they measured the decentralized renewable energy sector. And in Kenya, they provided 11,000 direct jobs as compared to 10,000 jobs in the on-grid sector. But most interesting, and because we are also talking about best practices with communities and how to engage them, most of our communities, as we know, they are on the informal sector. They are not directly employed in the formal sector. And for example, the use of the decentralized renewable sector employs twice as many workers through informal jobs and 5 times as many through productive use jobs. So this is I think this is the impact that the fact that we look into energy and all the players in the energy sector can play. Oil and gas companies, mining companies, renewable operators, off-grid and on-grid, they should act together in order to bring this sustainability.
No, that's very interesting in terms of talking of different actors. I see, Patty, you want to react. I mean, I'd like to hear your thoughts. I don't want to cut you.
Yeah, I think what Taciana said is exactly on point. And I think that there's one more factor to consider, even though, by default, you would think, oh, there's a big, oil and gas project coming, therefore there's going to be access to energy. That's not always the case. In fact, it's rarely the case. And in fact, I think, as Yanick said, most of this is for export. In many cases, it's for export to larger markets. Whereas, renewables obviously are much more localized. They're much more accessible. The local communities can benefit in a more immediate and more sustainable way, because I think Thomas was the one who mentioned, there's generally in many places a lack of infrastructure. So this is a really very important point, because in the past, I think a lot of large oil and gas companies have said, well, this isn't my business, so why would I invest in that? But we're really not talking about investing from a commercial standpoint. You're talking about investing from a community development and sustainability standpoint, and hopefully from an economic diversification standpoint, et cetera, all of which comes back to contributing towards the sustainable development goals, reduction of poverty, access to clean energy, all of which is now a fundamental part of the corporate expectations on corporations.
Maybe to you, thank you for your insight. I've looked at the same time at questions from on the chat. There's questions on regulations, and I know we probably will continue on with Yanick on trying to look at different framework from regulations. I know Thomas has a few insight also on the different 3 countries in terms of their regulations on this. There's questions on communities' livelihood, others specifically on the financing of small enterprises in countries. An example from Brazil and Argentina. I actually know exactly. I imagine the examples that are in mind. Those are interesting questions. Maybe for you, Thomas, the financing, inclusion of the financing world, because I know you wanted to say something on developing financial institutions. But yes, please, on the element of regulation, Yanick first, can you maybe give us a little more background on how to interact and include the different actors? We had a series of interaction and discussions with actors in a Mozambican government, Ugandese government, and others with you and some others around this panel. What is your vision on how the state apparatus or the regulation building? There's a work in Mozambique with the Programa Único. There's a series of different works in Uganda and Tanzania also. What is your views of how the framework of regulations can facilitate or sometimes hamper the developments, inclusive developments or developments of projects? I do realize I put all the answers in together to see which one you're going to focus on.
Maybe I'll start by perhaps giving a little bit of an overview and experience with regulation. And from that, the outcome that was by design, and also what would have been the intended outcomes that sometimes get neglected, specifically because of the specificity of regulation. When discussing oil and gas, a regulator for the massive projects and the awards and the concessions has been E&P. And in Uganda, I see that the Petroleum Authority of Uganda has a similar approach as to how they regulate participation, and as well as try to include local content. One of the discussed points, and one of the points that here locally in Mozambique, where it has also been discussed in Parliament, is the equity participation and what benefits that can have on a given project. The outcome was to try to define a majority Mozambican ownership onto a project. If we look at the developments in Nigeria, for example, they've managed to also have all local operators in oil and gas. But when you look at the context of Mozambique, most of the times you can't even have a benefit from that regulation, because internally we do not have the capacity to develop. So trying to define what is inclusive at times becomes isolationist, and as well as when you do have these companies able to participate, they're mostly the same players, and that does not allow for regional inclusion. The concessions negotiate the benefit of the communities because the government represents the communities. And a lot of the times what is included in those concessions are resettlement agreements on behalf of the communities, almost to move them out of the development zones, and also eliminate the responsibility further with those communities. But if a discussion that we were having earlier yesterday that I was personally looking into is because of the nationalization of the land and because of the law of occupation, where you cannot simply uproot indigenous people, even if there is a crucial project to the country, without first negotiating with those communities. Initially, it's looked at that the communities have no capital, but because essentially you can see it as they have some ownership to the land, an approach to the communities, and this is not legislated, an approach to the communities and actually understanding what would be more specifically their demands with something that they have a right over, sometimes has a better outcome. An example that I give is when we took the initiative and looked at the development of oil and gas in Mozambique, we saw some crucial regions that would be to the benefit of the oil companies that had no infrastructure. We approached government to try to, as locals, exclusively as a local initiative, obtain a concession and then negotiate with the multinationals the use of it. Our first approach was to go down to the district, to speak with the governors, to speak with the local chiefs, and as well as the communities and the unions that were there. And we found that their demands were very minimal, and they did not need to be excluded from that community to actually benefit from the project. So this is an approach that the law that protects their occupation entices people to communicate. But because at a concession level where the representation of the communities is government, sometimes the actual demands are not accounted for. And one of the things that we found where we wanted to develop a port infrastructure, the one demand, because it was an old port, was not revitalized, is that they wanted a dock for fisheries, which was very financially feasible, and a minimal demand for the community that had been there and neglected for quite some time. So legislation at times it's needed to put like a guide to how to interact, but at times when you put a number to it, the responsibility to the multinationals at times is just that. And as well as the communities, they don't have any more say further onto what development could be for them.
I appreciate the insight on this, and we've you mentioned a couple of times that we talked yesterday and another day, so that there's a series of conversation that we had coming up to it, and maybe we don't provide all the insights in this webinar. We're more than happy to receive questions afterwards or build on this if you want us to pursue. I think when the big debate on regulation, I appreciate what you mentioned is it not only the kind of text itself, but its capacity to be implemented and leading to economic diversification in the long run. So being able to answer, and that's the complexities of any policymakers, short-term expectation and sometimes higher than that should be reasonable, to long-term potentially building and diversification of models of development. And maybe on this question of economic diversification, if I could turn to you, Thomas, on this one, how can we see those investment in the energy sector, not only oil and gas, but in the energy sector as being models and motors towards economic diversification? I know we discussed about difference between skills and knowledge at some point. We discussed about models of collaboration with different stakeholders. If you want to address this, I'd like it. And there's always also a question from the audience on financial institutions, if you want to have a secondary question on this one.
Thank you, Remi. If you don't mind, I'll start with the question in regards to the financing.
Yep.
So thank you, Marcelo, for asking this question. And hi, by the way, it's been a long time, but glad to see you here. So in regards to the question, I'll just, Remi, I have an issue with the feed. Could you just remind the question of Marcelo?
See, I'm just going to get you exactly the question of Marcelo. He was basically giving an example from Argentina and Brazil, but looking at how there could be a series of setting up of small, let me just read it, good transnational companies working in those countries, consider backing up as collateral with some of local companies so that they get lower interest rates and loans from the banks, as it has been done in Brazil and Argentina. So I can actually send you those elements of Brazil and Argentina. I know there are cases in Mozambique. I know there's I saw that did something with a BCI. There was Catalisa as part of the projects in years.
Thank you, Remi. So yes, Marcelo, some companies are implementing this after earlier, and I think it was my introduction to the question, I was talking about passivity. And if you look at overall local content implementation in the general regulatory framework that concerns actually a majority of countries, it's mostly focused on mega project and oil and gas sector of activity, but very little on other activities which also have a key role to play. So we are basically, if you look at it from a governance point of view, and I'm going to generalize here because probably there are some countries who are doing differently, but it's asking the concessionaire, which core business is oil and gas, to cover or to be responsible for a lot of local content problematic which all have specific core business and activities related to access to the finance. It's no different. So so yes, this practice is being implemented, but I just want to remind to this, banks, it's their core business. Mega project, when they operate in the country, they provide new business, new activity, new opportunities that will generate new loans for the banks. And if this is not a good enough reason to review the markup and the process, I want to say it's a very good deal for banks, but this is a spot contribution in the sense that if these models are not internally by the banks to provide the ecosystem, not just focused on oil and gas activities, it will work, but it will only address a small part of activity within a very framed context. And that, I think, is very unfair. To be able to keep those markup, to be able to make so much more money on the background, and access to finance is a critical item to all these companies. So you're right, we are implementing this, and this is better than nothing. Let's be clear about it. However, to say that it is the responsibility of concessionaire to implement such things, and when supporting this project, it is very important also to acknowledge that this is also retrieving some responsibilities from the banks and the FIs that are in the country, that will be in the country for the coming decades and hundreds of years, and are able to address these general challenges, because they are general challenges that are not just related to the oil and gas supply chain, and it's just pushing the problem a bit further away. So to answer the question, yes, it's being done, but I think there are some margin for improvement, and this can be made possible through more discussion and dialogue. So I hope I was not too long into answering this question, and I hope I answered it right, Marcelo. Now, coming back to your question, Remi, on how energy investment can be harnessed to support economic diversification. So we talked about mega projects, lots of momentum on the market. So it is a leverage for investment. It attracts a lot of investment. So here we talk about industrialization. And I think it's important not just to support the existing companies, but also to develop a proper local offering, especially when we talk about support clusters or support activities. So we have the catering, of course, we have the logistics, storage, civil construction, and so on. Those activities are not oil and gas focused. So I'd just like to remind oil and gas activities, most of the activities in country are not oil and gas focused. There's a good momentum to develop the competitivity to these support clusters, way of speech, but it's also another to bring other investment and develop other activities. And why I'd like to particularly highlight one point is that when we talk about mega projects, they generate a lot of activities for a short amount of time. People develop competences and skills. And what tends to happen, if not prepared, is that this workforce who have been trained, same goes for the SMEs, they go then to the operation phase and they're left without a business, without a market. And it is visible, and there's a lot of cases like that where all these workers end up to being like taxi drivers or just migrate to the Limitrof country because there are some opportunities. So it's a total loss of skill that stay in country. And same go for SMEs. Some of them go bankruptcy while they were seen as star players in the country. So why I'm saying this is because there are several actors, and I mentioned some of the stakeholders earlier, who have a responsibility to bring other investment, develop local industrialization as a whole in the country. It could be related to agriculture, food transformation, and so on. But to be sure that there are opportunities to reinstate these newly skilled workers and SMEs with an appropriate and make sure that it stays in the country. So I'll stop here.
No, that was already a good first thing. If you stop here, actually looking at business ecosystem and economic diversification, I'm going to go a little bit further, going up towards communities, and that's gives me a good transition to Patricia on how to make sure not only that investment in the energy sector benefit the business ecosystem and the creation of skills and diversification economically, but also towards the conditions of population on the ground and the interaction with communities, trying to have transparent communication and maybe offer them other opportunities completely on the side of the projects.
Thank you, Remi, and thank you to the participants who've been sending in these excellent questions. I wish we had more time, days to discuss these, but first I want to clarify when I mentioned before, when I talked about land use rights and resettlement. Resettlement requires livelihood restoration, and livelihood restoration really is not a corporate social responsibility or a local content activity. It is actually putting people back into the position they were before. So providing them with some type of livelihood that makes them equal. And I say that because that is not, that is the minimum, the absolute minimum. On top of that, you have development of workforce and supplier capacity. But in addition to that, you have community development, community economic diversification. And this is where we talked about going to the communities. The communities have to be a significant participant in providing information back to the corporations, whether it's through their social sustainability groups or through whatever the setup is. But that communication does need to take place, and the decision-making needs to be joint. I know this sounds like it's very idealistic, but actually, I think the point that Yanick was making is that oftentimes in prior days, because I know many of the larger companies do this now, but there was a concern that, oh, if we go ask what they want, they're going to come back with these, very large schemes or extremely expensive things that are not feasible. That's not really the case in the base case. Communities have more, their demands tend to be more localized. And second of all, they know best what they do actually have the potential to do, what is actually sustainable for them. And I think as Tomas mentioned, things, programs such as developing, agriculture and other innovative type of activities which have to be financed.
Maybe to build on this and let you maybe continue after, but we did a specific webinar a couple of months ago on tackling relationship between energy projects and indigenous communities especially in Canada, and we looked at the project reconciliation project on the gas link projects from Alberta to British Columbia, where there's a trust structure with joint decision making on a very specific approach to social and developments, where academic actors from different universities, obviously TC Energy, obviously other communities are part of decision schemes. So if, just as a parenthesis, if anyone is interested, just go on our website. Well, I'm happy to send the link so that people can see how this can be operated. Obviously the situation in Canada is different from Mozambique. There are different capacities and so on, but that could be an interesting blueprint or ideas of pilot projects that actually they're implemented at large scale could be actually quite interesting to for these developments. Please continue. Sorry, Patty, I didn't want to cut you.
No, not at all. And I appreciate this because this is actually a global issue, but we're going to talk specifically about Mozambique and of course Tanzania and Uganda. And I think from a community perspective, it is critical that they be a participant and I don't know if you'd call it voting member or part of the decision-making process, because they know better than the corporations. And oftentimes, you'll come in with the best intentions, with the absolute best intentions, saying, oh, well, this is what we think you should do. And they'll, it just doesn't work for the social fabric of that particular community. I think the other thing that you have to be a little bit careful of is that one solution applies to all the communities. That's not the case. But I think Taciana and Tomas both brought up the issue of financing and microfinancing, the incredible innovative spirit and creativity that different people in the communities can have is a source that has to be tapped. And very often what they need in terms of an investment is very, very minimal financing, and microfinance schemes working with the national banks and other types of shorter term investments that generate longer term results, reinvesting into cooperatives, that kind of thing, are often more successful from a sustainability standpoint and allow for the changes in growth, because the community will change. Inevitably, the community will change and the needs will change.
That transitions me perfectly to Taciana, and we were discussing ahead of this webinar, but we can continue on this of the importance of having a bottom-up approach to participation, including and mapping the SDGs to communities, and where you can have this capacity of micro companies, micro enterprise, with a series of clear, transparent methodologies to implement those projects. How can this contribute to some of those SDGs? And maybe Taciana, if you can help me elaborate on this and provide examples example. I mean, I can also provide some Tanzania, Uganda, but you can do Mozambique, any country that you wish. I'm happy to build on this. And we're going to be going a little bit beyond the hour time. Sorry, please take your time, because I think people might be interested to stay longer, and I want to listen to you.
Thank you, Remi. So I would just like to make a comment following Thomas and Patty's in terms of the financing, because it really, from my example, I'm training Mozambican micro and SMEs and also businesses that are owned by women. And really the access to financing, it's the crucial point, because if we train them in all the other components, like they know how to write a business plan, they know how to manage their accounts, they know everything about health and safety, they know everything about ethical and compliance, but then they arrive to the commercial bank and boom, there is a big corporation that besides all the trainings, they just have either huge interest rates, or they have to go through another very cumbersome and bureaucratic process to get access to finance. And actually in Mozambique, we are very creative. And we have a couple of community structures for financing. One of them is called Chitik, which is something that the communities do, that they put money every week, like we do that at home. We put money every week, and every week the money goes to someone of the household. And most of the small tiny projects, they work based on this structure, and this is a part of the how are we going to tackle sustainable development goals. We need to also start to create opportunities on the financing sector to these micro entities that usually are individuals, to do their work. And again, if we go to, for example, women-owned business, we have at MWE, we are supporting some women, and we are developing a pilot project which is called Girafa Solar, in cooperation with another foundation, Carlos Morgado Foundation, where we just make a solar installation on rural areas, off-grid areas, that just charges like around 20 cell phones and radios, and it's like a small hub of the community, and we train women to manage that installation. But we want to replicate this, and we are unable to raise funding for this very limited installation. So this is the reality, right? And so I really think that this access to finance is extremely important, besides, of course, the training of the capacities and all this. I'm not sure if you want me to also to answer to one of the questions of the panelists.
I'm more than happy for you to take one of the questions.
The role of international community or local community to ensure sustainability to clean energy. So in terms of our government and the targets and the commitments that our government took in terms of clean energy and sustainable energy, we have a couple of targets under our energy strategy, but most recently under our 5-year government plan. And we tend to reach until 2013. I really don't remember now what is the percentage, exact percentage of on-grid electrification, but it's a huge step towards electrification. But in terms of concrete projects, I can give 2 examples. So the government is running a project that is an auction project for some sites that will develop renewable energy up to 40 megawatts. And on the off-grid, of course, there are a couple of projects that will support mini-grids, the implementation of mini-grids, mostly in the capital of the districts, called postos administrativos, and also together with the other energy services, such as home solar systems and clean cooking stoves. And we have some donors as well highly supporting the private sector to invest on these projects.
Mm-hmm. No, but that's interesting when you're talking about, you know, the importance of harnessing some of the projects that are very different, but the capacity of a solar energy project, of developing, you know, positive outcome for development. This is a very specific element of a small project, but you can have the same ideas of looking at a larger in terms of oil and gas multi-billion investment, of trying to have those capacities to engage with communities and engage with small businesses and provide them a voice to discuss of how to support some of their projects, either community-led projects for rural electrifications, for example, that can be, and if you talk with energy access, that was part of another webinar, you can see the business case here. It's actually a business case that is profitable if it's actually supported. So we're not talking about grants and giving money away. We're talking about having some of those vehicles to be able to promote and harness a large part of the like an investment on the side of a large investment to try to show the dedication to communities and therefore facilitate the social license to operate. If I'm going very quickly in terms of connecting dots, but that's also important to be able to bridge that gap in terms of socio-economic situation on the ground, and an element of obviously large perceived investment on the other side. There's also the needs from the concessionaires and the operators to be able to really see, and find the actors on the ground to build some programs of capacity building, based not only on general knowledge or specific skills, but more generally on being able to replicate it on a model of economy that would be diversified. So it's a very wide series of issues and topics that we've covered here in this webinar. But the idea here for me is really to try to see and set the stage for a further conversation, obviously. And those are topics where we exchange on different medium, good publications or elements of thought leadership on how to provide this. There are some very good case studies that are very specific in some areas, but can be somewhat replicated, even if we're in the case of, let's say, the project, Jacob project, we're talking about a large pipeline from Uganda to Mozambique. On some other cases, some publication might be looking at a more, let's say, 40 megawatt energy project. There are some methodologies that can be replicated, especially when you have a pipeline that's going to be outside of the ground because of the nature of the crude here, and therefore there will have to be much more community engagement throughout the path of pipelines. The companies have projects obviously and interest, and that they can do so much in terms of being able to engage with communities, but they can also rely with a series of different actors, whether national and international, to facilitate the link with other secondary objectives that benefit the communities, and there in return benefit their project and the profitability on their project, because you will not face some socioeconomic hurdles or sometimes suspension for different issues, and therefore allow investors to have a return on their investment and facilitate the trickling down of the SDGs. This is a very wide range of topics that we try to cover, and probably a very long sentence to try to put this all together, but we're going to try to build on this webinar. We're probably going to provide the written transcript. I have to run it by the panelists first, but I don't think any kind of confidential information was shared, but that we are happy to share this. And I'm happy to say that Billy, I can call the 4 panelists here my friends, so I'm happy to have you here, and I've talked about the last few months on those issues, and I know of their personal qualities and the capacities for them to answer to them if you reach out on the specific questions. So please do so and reach out to us if you can be of any help. Please, Patty, Taciana, Yanick and Thomas, I just wanted to say thank you again. Thank you for the attendance, for coming here, and I look forward to our next conversation. Sounds good? Cheers, and thank you very much for being here. Bye.
Cheers, bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.